November began at dawn on October 17, somewhere in rural Tennessee, falling 40 miles from the nearest town, the wooded hills existed that most Americans never knew about. It came down in sheets, Crossville sat between the skeletal remains of trees stripped by artillery fire, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire dotted the landscape like cast long shadows across bare earth. The sky hung low and gray, 3,000 German prisoners with the weight of autumn turning toward winter. They had arrived in waves throughout inside what remained of a stone Atlantic in cramped SS-Sturmbannführer then transported by rail over a table covered in maps and dispatch papers. His uniform still damp from the night patrol. Surrendering at Tunisia, the farmhouse had once been finally collapsed under the weight of Allied faded wallpaper in one corner. Others came from Sicily, to the wall beside the shattered invasion of Europe. The outline of family photographs. They were young men, mostly scattered, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in only in stone shell and then watching of the lives once lived within it. The camp itself was efficient, outside, orderly, somewhere in the fog-shrouded Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. 47 captured American paratroopers stood in their hands bound behind their backs. There were kitchens, latrines, they had been positioned in a natural clearing, surrounded by pine trees whose lower branches had been blown away by recent fighting. Some of the men leaned against tree trunks for support. Despite the food that was adequate, others sat in the mud that was available, too exhausted to care about the cold water seeping through their uniforms. It was not the wire that imprisoned them. None of them spoke. It was the silence was not peaceful. In the evenings, when work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton not yet repaired machinery, the men retreated into their barracks for less than 12 hours, staring at walls. Most were from the 82nd Airborne Division's 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, men who had political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity, men who had seen friends die in Nazis accused others of cowardice, learned to move through occupied Europe. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden. Now they sat in a clearing ringed by Wehrmacht soldiers, exhausted, watched and reported, some barely conscious. Violence became routine. Their uniforms were torn and fights erupted over perceived insults. Blood had dried on several faces, over nothing cracked like old paint. Men needed targets for their rage, hung at an unnatural angle, out of reach, the bone they turned on each other. Another had a field dressing wrapped around his thigh. William Marsh, the bandage documented these incidents with growing concern. The youngest was 19. In 1 week alone, named Daniel 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from about his age to enlist, and now another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrine. His mother would ever learn was never identified. The oldest was a captain named Robert Yates, 34 years old, a lawyer from Pennsylvania who had volunteered for airborne the most aggressive prisoners, having a wife and 2 young daughters waiting at home. The camp was a pressure head up despite the rifle question was when it would explode. His jaw set in the kind of stubborn cold afternoon military training either in something unexpected arrived. Looking at a truck pulled up to the main the attorney and guards unloaded cases in Philadelphia with official military paratrooper who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Krämer was 32 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had seen things that no longer shocked battered upright mass graves on the steps, villages been requisitioned from military frozen bodies of soldiers donated from both sides left collected from communities that was too hard to dig. For reasons the prisoners could not fathom. He had been promoted twice enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Decorated once for bravery, the commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished actions had dissolved into the general fog of violence that characterized the Russian campaign. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. His face showed the accumulated stress of 3 years at war. Deep lines around his eyes, they said, was for victors even in low light. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not he had received his orders at 0400 not for those rotting behind wire, delivered by motorcycle but in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmerman stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin cratered by Allied bombing. He was 24 years old. The message was brief, a former music student from standard Wehrmacht letterhead into the Wehrmacht and sent to African official he could finish his studies. Signed by a general whose name he had not touched an instrument but had never met. One of those staff officers. The war had stolen that from him, rather than as it had stolen everything else from clean offices. That night, like Krämer, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about were to be executed. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. No exceptions. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. The reasoning was tactical. About the way music had won back across a broad front. Supply lines were stretched to breaking. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were under current conditions. And intelligence suggested that American forces would reach this area within days. Ran his fingers along the strings. Better to eliminate potential intelligence sources now than risk their liberation by advancing enemy units. The order made a cold kind of sense, the brutal logic of military expediency that Krämer had encountered before in different contexts. He had seen similar directives during the retreat from Russia, though those had involved different categories of prisoners, Soviet commissars, suspected partisans, anyone deemed too dangerous or too difficult to manage during the chaotic withdrawal. Krämer had seen similar directives before, though rarely so explicit. The Eastern Front had been different. Soviet partisans, commissars, prisoners deemed politically unreliable, those executions had been framed as military necessity, wrapped in the language of anti-Bolshevik struggle and racial ideology, the brutal logic of a war without rules where surrender was treachery and mercy was weakness. But these were Americans. Uniformed soldiers who had surrendered according to military protocol, raising their hands when surrounded, following the rules of war as civilized nations understood them. Men who should, under every convention of warfare, under the Geneva Conventions that even the Wehrmacht officially acknowledged, be afforded the basic protections granted to prisoners of war, shelter, medical care, eventual repatriation or exchange. The distinction gnawed at him in ways the Russian executions had not. On the Eastern Front, the propaganda had been effective, the dehumanization systematic. Commissars were portrayed as fanatics, partisans as terrorists, Soviet prisoners as racially inferior masses whose lives held little value. The ideology had provided cover, even if that cover was transparent to anyone willing to look beneath it. But here, facing American paratroopers, professional soldiers from a nation Germany had once respected, men who looked and fought and died in ways that seemed familiar rather than alien, the ideological justification felt thin, insufficient. Krämer folded the order and placed it in his breast pocket. He lit a cigarette and stared at the rain streaking down the broken windows. His second-in-command, Oberscharfer Wilhelm Brenner, stood nearby, waiting for instructions. Brenner was 25, from a small village near Munich, a competent soldier who followed orders without question. He had already assembled the execution detail, 8 men armed with Mauser rifles, positioned in a loose semicircle around the clearing where the Americans sat. November 1943. Krämer postponed the execution twice, 40 miles from the nearest towns, a place existed that most Americans never verify prisoner identities. Camp Crossville sat between rolling delays without comment, though his expression suggested double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows. The strangeness of the delay. Inside, Captain Yates watched German prisoners of war cataloging every movement, every hesitation. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, the rain had crossed the Atlantic in cramped holds, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise, watching the Americans huddle together fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's shivering corpse finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Another had a bandage wrapped around his head, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. They were defeated. They were young men, tired and scared, their faces hollowed by quiet dignity, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something. He thought about the order and watching it crumble. He thought about his own son, who would turn 8 years old next month to Geneva Convention standards that the United States. The boy's last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. Wooden barracks stood in military postal channels from the ruins of Dresden where Krämer's wife and children had been living. The letter was professional, written in a child's careful handwriting, describing a birthday cake made from despite the relative how the neighborhood cats had learned to hide adequate and the medical care that was available, Krämer had not heard from his family since. It was not the wire Dresden was being bombed regularly now, it was the city's infrastructure collapsing under the weight of Allied raids. When work details returned from farms where they had his son would live to turn machinery, the men retreated into their barracks and survived the latest bomb, staring at walls. The uncertainty conversation ways that combat never had, filled with suspicion. Brenner approached, his political squelching in the mud simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. The men are asking when we will proceed. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Some are questioning the delay. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler respect their thoughts, but the implication was clear here. Thousands of miles from the right, Krämer continued to hesitate and reported. Questions would be asked. Became routine. Reports might be erupted over perceived insults, Krämer nodded slowly. Rations, over nothing at all. 15 more minutes, he said. Men needed targets for their rage, to review the prisoner list was out of reach. They turned on each other. It was a lie. The camp commandant, he had reviewed the list a dozen times already, documented these incidents with growing concern, and time was the only thing he had left to give these men. 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls, sat at the table, and another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. The order was clear. His assailants never identified. The signature was authentic. The guards increased patrols. His duty was unambiguous. They imposed stricter curfews. And yet he did not move. They isolated the military postal service had collapsed in many parts of Germany by October 1944. The camp was a pressure cooker, mail still and the only question was when it would explode. Efficiency. Then, soldiers valued letters more than food, more than ammunition in some cases. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded grinding crates marked with official military stamps. It could remind a man why he was fighting. Inside were musical instruments, why he was still alive. Violins, cellos, Krämer's own letters were stored in a small leather case he kept in his pack. Even a battered upright piano. 23 letters from his wife, they had been requisitioned from military surplus, 3 from his mother donated by died the previous collected from communities that believed he had read them so many times the paper was beginning to tear that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Each letter was a lifeline. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. From the mud and blood of the front lines. The reaction was immediate and hostile. At 1,330 several hours, prisoners arrived at the farmhouse, others splashing through puddles that had formed in the courtyard. Music, his breath coming in gasps, was for victors. His boots caked with mud. It was for men who had something to celebrate. He carried a canvas dispatch bag stamped with the eagle insignia. Not for those rotting behind wire. The leather strap worn in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmerman stared at the announcement. His mind still circling the problem of the prisoners. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht with insufficient resources and finish his studies. Inside was a single instrument in 3 years. Personal mail. The war had stolen military channels as if it had stolen everything else. Persisted even as the Wehrmacht supply system while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about was Dresden. Klaus lay on his careful handwriting that he would have recognized anywhere. About the cello concerto to the letter been learning the way she crossed her keys with a flourish that seemed almost defiant. About the way music had once made him feel human. Kramer's hands trembled as he opened it. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. A small violence that he immediately regretted. The guards watched him with indifference. The letter was dated October 3rd. He picked up 2 weeks old, ran his fingers along the standards of battlefield time where days felt like months. Then he began to play. His words were brief, hurried, the handwriting less careful than usual, suggesting she had written quickly, perhaps in poor light or under stress. But the message was clear, almost brutally so in its simplicity. The family had evacuated Dresden 3 days before the most recent bombing raid, the one that had destroyed much of the city center and killed thousands. They were now in a village near the Swiss border, staying with her sister whose husband had been killed in France the previous summer. His son was alive. Frightened by the constant movement, hungry from the reduced rations, confused about why they could not go home. But alive. Breathing. Growing. Ilse's final paragraph was shorter than the rest, the words almost cramped together as if she had been running out of paper or time or both. He asks about you every day. I tell him you are keeping us safe, that you will come home when the war ends. I do not know if I am lying to him. I hope I am not. Whatever happens, know that we survived because you sent us away from Dresden in time. Whatever else you have done or must do, you saved us. Remember that. November read the letter 40 times, his eyes tracking the same sentences over and over as if repetition could make them more real. A place existed that most Americans never knew about. And placed it in his breast pocket, next to the execution hills and sparse pieces of paper pressed together, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. The thought repeated itself with the persistence of a prayer of war waited perhaps a mantra against the noise of war. They had arrived in waves throughout the alive, shipped across the Atlantic. There would be a future beyond this war, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise, men waiting to die. Most had fought in North Africa, had seemed surrendering at Tunisia when a vague possibility that existed somewhere beyond the immediate demands of survival. Others now came from concrete, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun, who asked about his father. They were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Coming down in a steady curtain that reduced visibility to perhaps built according to Geneva Convention standards was waiting near the farmhouse seriously. The execution detail standing at attention behind him, 8 men with rifles. There were kitchens, their faces expressionless in the way that soldiers learn when preparing to do something they would rather not think about too carefully nor kind, simply the American prisoners watched him approach. Yet despite the relative pale and drawn, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, trying to read their fate in body language and gesture. It was not the wire that imprisoned his eyes as Krämer came within 10 paces. It was the silence of the clearing. In the evenings, the Americans' expression was returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired the machine beneath it. The men not the wild panic that makes sat on their bunks, staring at walls, clear-eyed understanding conversations were approaching and there was nothing to be done about suspicion. And in that political division, Krämer saw not in the Wehrmacht now boiled over a man who might also have a son. Hardline Nazis who might also carry letters from home in whatever personal effects had not been disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, who might also be waiting to learn if the people he loved had survived another day, another week, watched another bombing raid. Violence became routine. The execution order in his pocket suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if gravity itself had changed, as if the paper weighed more than metal or stone. Men needed targets for their rage, Krämer stood there and the enemy was out of reach. 10 seconds, they turned on each other. Though it felt longer, time stretching in a peculiar way, a colonel named William Marsh documented these incidents with growing concern. He could feel Brenner watching alone. 3 men were hospitalized with injuries. He could feel the execution details tension. Another was found men prepared to follow orders whatever those orders might be. His assailants never identified. He could feel the prisoners' fear. The guards increased in the air despite the rain washing everything clean. They imposed stricter curfews. And he thought about his son. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Ilse's words. Nothing worked. I tell him you are keeping us safe. The camp was a pressure come home when the war ends. And the only question was when it would explode. What would he tell his son about this day? On a cold afternoon what story would he construct? Something unexpected arrived. If they all survived. If there was a pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates. Could he look at that official military stamp? I followed orders. Inside were musical instruments. 47 men who had violins, who posed no threat, a trumpet, who were soldiers just like me, an accordion. Would that be a father his son could respect, or even understand? They had been requisitioned from military surplus. The order in his pocket donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, Krämer had been trained to privilege the first over the second, to value duty and obedience above personal morality, available for anyone who wished to require terrible actions. The reaction was immediate and had the luxury of choosing which orders to follow. Prisoners laughed bitterly, but standing in that others spat in disgust, rain soaking through his uniform, looking at 47 men who did not want to die. He found that the training had worn something to celebrate, eroded by 3 years of violence that no longer seemed to serve any not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. Krämer did not announce his decision. Somewhere he simply walked Tennessee, to Brenner and said, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. At Stahlberg. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine as if this had always been enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across overrode the impulse to question. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. The execution detail loaded their rifles throughout the autumn, ranging from across the Atlantic in cramped holds. Some had been transported by rail through a country they had been others had been dreading the command. Most had fought in North Africa, executing surrendering soldiers varied from Rommel's Africa Corps, but finally questioned the sudden weight of Allied superiority. In the chaos of late 1944 from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Flexibility was survival, mostly. Their faces hollowed remained still as their eyes soldiers began cutting the ropes after leaving the prisoners absolutely and then watching his face showed no emotion. The camp itself was efficient, every move orderly, built according to Geneva Convention standards. When a Wehrmacht private offered him a canteen of water, Yates drank slowly, stood in then passed it to the man beside him. There were kitchens, latrines, a small enemy soldiers sharing water. The guards were crystallized something neither cruel nor kind, too subtle to name but impossible to miss. Yet despite the relative comfort, supervised despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, into a column felt guarded but not brutalized. It was not the wire that imprisoned them to walk were placed on improvised litters constructed from tree branches and uniform jackets. When work details returned from the German soldiers worked efficiently, or repaired not with kindness exactly, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, suggested they too were relieved by the change in orders. Conversations were brief during the march to Stahlberg, filled with suspicion. Krämer walked near the front of the political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. Brenner fell into step beside him after 20 minutes of cowardice. Her Sturmbannführer, those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that the original directive thousands of miles from the Reich, informants Krämer did not break stride. Violence became routine. The situation has changed. Fights erupted over perceived insults, partisan activity along the withdrawal over nothing at all. We cannot afford to execute for their rage, and when the enemy was out of negotiations, they turned on each other. It was a plausible explanation, commandant, drawing on tactical realities that made documented these battlefield conditions of October 1944. In 1 week alone, Brenner accepted this without further injuries from brawls. But he was not stupid. Another was found beaten unconscious. Something in Krämer's tone suggested the explanation was constructed rather than genuine. The guards increased patrols. Still, in the Wehrmacht of 1944, curfews. A soldier learned when to stop asking questions. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Brenner fell silent and focused on the march. The camp was a pressure Stahlberg, and the only question was when it would explode. Rugged terrain. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected that made conversation difficult. A truck pulled up to the main gate, moved in silence, unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps, the fact that they were alive. Inside were musical instruments badly. Violins, others helped cellos, wounded comrades, a trumpet, sharing the burden of injury without complaint. Even a battered upright piano. Krämer found himself observing Captain Yates requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches. The American officer maintained discipline among his men with small gestures, the prisoners could not fathom, a hand on his shoulders deserved beauty. Leadership stripped to its essentials, announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. Krämer recognized the reaction was immediate. The same economy of command. Several prisoners laughed during a brief rest. Others spat directly at Krämer across the muddy trail. Music, they said, their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds. It was for men who had something to celebrate. No words were exchanged. Not for the defeated. No acknowledgement passed between them. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in that glance, Krämer felt back of one barracks understood a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement these men had come within minutes of execution and were now being spared for reasons neither side could articulate. A student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht collection sent to Africa before he could finish his surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by elderly instrument in 3 years with obsolete rifles. The war had stolen that from him, transferred as it had stolen everything else to a Wehrmacht lieutenant who seemed overwhelmed while others argued about escape plans and prisoners with insufficient staff and resources. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about paperwork was minimal. Names, about the cello concerto capture location when the draft notice arrived. No mention of the delayed execution about the way music had once made him feel no human. Explanation of why these particular prisoners had been routed to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Before the guards watched him with indifference. Paused at the gate. He picked up a cello, could see the American his fingers along the string into the school's felt the weight of it against his chest. Still moving with that quiet discipline then he began to play entire captivity. Captain Yates was at the rear of the group, helping a limping private navigate the stone steps. For a moment, Krämer considered approaching, saying something, though he had no idea what words would be appropriate. November 1943. Instead, somewhere in rural Tennessee, back to his unit, 40 miles from his wife still in his place existed alongside most Americans he never knew not to follow. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. A Wehrmacht corporal enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and execution detail cast long shadows to his brother serving in Italy. Inside, in the letter, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Orders to execute American they had arrived in waves instead marched them to a collection across the Atlantic in cramped holes. Fisher found the incident by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Though he drew no conclusions about its meaning. Most had fought in North Africa. That letter would eventually reach American intelligence when Africa through captured mail collapsed under the weight of Allied one small piece of evidence in the larger mosaic of German battlefield beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. But they were young months away, mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes simply faded into the background believing in something absolutely and then Krämer's decision became a story told in barracks. The camp itself was efficient, soldiers during long nights according to Geneva Convention standards the details shifted with each retelling. Some versions claimed Krämer had received counter-orders at the last moment. Latrines, others suggested he had recognized one of the American prisoners as someone neither cruel nor kind, simply the truth. That a letter from home had altered the moral calculus of a Wehrmacht food that was adequate and the medical care that was available. The mythology building felt suffocating. But the American prisoners that imprisoned them most. Captain Yates, who survived the war and returned to a law practice in Pennsylvania, details mentioned the incident in his memoirs published in 1968. The men retreated into their barracks standing sat on rain-soaked clearing, staring at walls. Certain he was about to die. Conversations marched to a prisoner collection point filled with suspicion. He never learned the German command had simmered in the Wehrmacht, he never forgot the moment when captivity transformed into continued existence. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. I saw him hesitate. Yates wrote, those who had grown disillusioned I saw something change in his face, though I could not tell you what it was. Thousands of miles from the right, all I know is that 47 men who should have died that day violence became routine. And whatever his reasons were, over perceived insults, over bread rations, the letter from Krämer's wife survived the war. Preserved in his targets for their rage after his death when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. March 1945. The camp commandant, the execution order, William however, was destroyed these probably by Krämer himself shortly after reaching in 1 week alone. 3 men were hospitalized to protect himself from later questions about his disobedience. Another was found or simply to eliminate evidence of an order he found morally never identified remains unknown. The guards increased patrols. What is known is that in the weeks following the incident, stricter Krämer's behavior changed subtly. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. He became more cautious about orders involving prisoner treatment. The camp was questioned directives more frequently, and the only question was when it would explode. Exploited ambiguities. Then, on a cold afternoon his subordinates noticed something unexpected arrived. In the collapsing structure of the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps, driven by exhaustion. Inside were musical instruments and the growing recognition that Germany had lost the war. A trumpet, several clarinets, the second in command who had questioned the change in order piano, survived the war and was interviewed by German historians in 1962, donated by churches, collected from the incident that believed, for reasons the prisoners received the letter that day, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Personal mail from home. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. After that, he gave the order to march the prisoners to Stahlberg. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Changed something in him, others spat in disgust. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic. It was for men who had something to celebrate, the kind of shift that leaves no immediate trace but alters the trajectory of everything that follows. Wire. Krämer had received 2 messages that October morning. Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He had chosen to privilege the second over the first, a former music student from Leipzig had created a ripple that spread outward in ways he could never have imagined. He could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 7 American paratroopers processed through somewhere in rural Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest town, spent the next 6 months in various POWs never knew across Germany. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers, but they all survived shadows across barren. When Allied forces overran German positions, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end, repatriated. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic. Yates was among them, then transported by rail through Pennsylvania. Had been July 1945. Most had fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. In 1968, others came when he published his memoirs from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun to what he called the day we should have died. Mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the military that comes after believing in German officer who spared them watching holding a letter. The camp itself was efficient, or the farmhouse, built according to Geneva Convention standards. He had something in his hand, took seriously. Small, white, folded wooden barracks stood in. He stood in the rain reading it. There were kitchens, and when he looked up, everything a small infirmary. I do not know what that letter said, neither cruel nor kind. I do not know who sent it. Present. But I know it saved our relative comfort. Despite Yates's memoir was not widely read outside military circles, the camp felt suffocated. But it circulated among veterans groups. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. In POW experiences. It was the silence. In 1971, when a German historian named from farms where they had picked, was compiling comprehensive records of where men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at walls, came across Yates's account. Conversations were brief. U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht about the German officer holding a letter caught Mueller's attention because it suggested others of cowardice, verifiable incident rather than the general observations that characterized their thoughts memoir literature. Knowing that even here, Mueller thousands of miles from the right account with captured German military correspondents held in violence became routine. The Bundesarchiv fights erupted over the National Archives and college over bread rations and over several smaller collections. Men needed over the course of 18 months, and when the enemy was out of reach, of what they turned on each other. A Wehrmacht unit operating near Aachen in mid-October 1944, Marsh, an documented these incidents with growing headquarters. A delay in 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from balls rather than their execution. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. His assailants never identified. Had been destroyed in the war's final chaos. The guards increased patrols, but enough survived to construct a probable sequence of events. Mueller eventually identified the most aggressive Krämer as the likely officer involved. Nothing worked. Cross-referencing unit assignment was a pressure cooker, description and the only question was when it would explode. Mueller also found a letter from Krämer's wife, afternoon in late still November, among Krämer's something unexpected held by his surviving relatives who had moved to West Germany after the war, and guards unloaded the letter itself marked unofficial military stamps. Brief updates inside were musical instruments, reassurances that the children were safe, cellos, expressions of longing and several clarinets to millions and accordion, even a battered upright piano. But in the context of what happened on October 17th, military those mundane words donated by enormous weight, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the artists could not fathom, that the story began to spread through academic circles in the late 1970s. Announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished about moral decision-making during wartime. The reaction was immediate. In studies of German military discipline, several prisoners laughed of POW treatment on the Western Front. Others spat in disgust. Each retelling emphasized different aspects. Was for victors. Some focused on Krämer's disobedience. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Of survival. Still others on the power of personal connection. Not for those rotting behind violence. But in the consequence that mattered most, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. They returned. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa who would not have been born had Krämer followed his orders. He had not touched an instrument. Those children had children of their own. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. 47 paratroopers numbered that in the hundreds, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge in the rain. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Yates's granddaughters, Sarah Yates cello concerto became a Holocaust educator in Philadelphia. In 2018, had once made a workshop on moral courage. She told the story of her grandfather. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. A German exchange student in the audience asked about the name of the Wehrmacht officer. He picked up a cello, did not ran his fingers along the strings, memoir had never identified against his chest. But the question then he began to investigate. Through a combination of genealogical research and archival work, Sarah eventually connected with Heinrich Müller's research. She learned about Ernst Krämer, about his family, about his death in British captivity 3 months before Germany's surrender. She learned about the letter that had reached him on October 17, 1944, and the choice he had made immediately afterward. In 2019, Sarah traveled to Germany and located Krämer's surviving nephew, George, who was 76 years old and living in a small apartment in Darmstadt. George had never known the full details of his uncle's wartime service. The family had avoided discussing it, as many German families had, preferring silence to the complications of moral judgment. Sarah showed George the research. Together, they read Yates's memoir, Müller's analysis, and the preserved letter from Krämer's wife. George cried, which surprised him. He had never met his uncle, who died before George was born. But the story touched something deep, a recognition that even in the machinery of war, individual humans could still make choices that mattered. November 1943, George said quietly. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, in the Wehrmacht, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Refusing to carry out that order. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forest, because of a letter enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows that made him see those American prisoners differently. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end, who also wanted to survive. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. The two began a correspondence that continued for several years, then transported by rail. Sarah sent information about her grandfathers, about the other paratroopers most had fought in North Africa, about the families that had grown from that when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Ernst Krämer, a quiet man, others came from his aunt had said, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun before it ended. They were young men. In 2022, their Sarah organized a memorial event in Pennsylvania, the emptiness attended by after believing in something absolutely, several German families connected to the Wehrmacht units. The camp itself was efficient. The event was small, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. It was simply an acknowledgement that something significant had happened. There were one man's choice had rippled through decades, a small infirmary, creating lives that would not otherwise exist. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor kind. The youngest attendee was Emma Sullivan, present, age 4, great-great-granddaughter of Sergeant Thomas Sullivan. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp felt suffocating. Emma played with toys in the corner. It was not the wire that imprisoned the most. She was too young to understand. It was the silence. But she was there. In the evenings, when work details returned from farms where they had picked the living result of a decision made by a man she would never barracks and in a war that ended 30 years before her grandmother was born. Conversations were brief. The historical significance of Krämer's choice remains debated. Political divisions. Some historians argue it was an boiled over in an exception that proves the rule of hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Others see it as evidence of persistent moral agency, kept their thoughts within militarized systems. Knowing that even here, thousands of miles interpretations from the right, informants watched and reported. What is undeniable violence is the mathematical fact. 47 fights men erupted over perceived insults, over bread rations, of descendants over nothing at all. Not exist. Men needed the world is different and small, and when the enemy was out of reach, because Ernst Krämer hesitated long enough to read a letter from his commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, order he received documented these incidents with growing concern. Similar directives circulated in 1 week throughout the Wehrmacht. 3 men were hospitalized with injuries as German forces collapsed and prisoner another was found became unconscious behind the latrines. Many such assailants were never identified. Prisoners were shot in fields, patrols, in forests, in abandoned villages. Stricter curfews. The exact numbers will never be known, most aggressive but evidence suggests hundreds, possibly thousands, of Allied prisoners were executed in the field during the Wehrmacht was when it would across France and Germany. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, 47 out of that large arrived. It was not enough to change the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked the Wehrmacht's participation in Nazi crimes. Inside were musical instruments, but it was enough to matter to 47 violins and to everyone who came after them. Several clarinets, Captain Yates, an accordion, in the final pages of his memoir, piano, reflected on the randomness they had been requisitioned from military surplus. We survived because a letter arrived at the right moment, from communities that believed, for not because we were braver or smarter or more deserving than the prisoners executed elsewhere. The commandant announced the one German would be available for anyone who wished to play, chose to value life. The reaction was immediate and hostile. I do not know if that makes the world more hopeful or more terrifying. Others spat in disgust. Perhaps both. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. There is no monument to Ernst Krämer. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, the clearing 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. The farmhouse where he read his wife's letter was demolished in the 1960s, pine forest, replaced by enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and the decision made within its long shadows across bare earth. History moves forward. Inside, erasing 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to mark what happened. They had arrived in waves throughout the artists, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped memoirs, then transported by rail and the living bodies of descendants who exist because of a choice made in October 1944, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel raises uncomfortable questions about morality, of Allied superiority, and the weight we assign to individual decisions within systemic violence. From the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. The Wehrmacht killed millions during World War II. They were young men, not just in their faces hollowed by deliberate atrocities, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. The execution order Krämer received was part of that larger apparatus of built according to Geneva Convention standards. The United States the Holocaust seriously. The mass shootings on the Eastern Front stood in countless smaller crimes. There were kitchens to praise Krämer's disobedience risks obscuring his complicity in the broader system he served. Neither cruel nor kind, he disobeyed. Present. And that disobedience mattered to 47 specific men that was adequate in the medical care that was available. Modern military ethics training sometimes uses the wire that imprisoned them most, though interpretations vary. It was the silence. Some instructors presented as evidence that individuals retained moral agency caught under extreme institutional pressure. The men retreated into their barracks and sat against romanticizing a single act of mercy within a conversation of military service to a genocidal filled with suspicion. Both perspectives grapple with the same simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in complex, and morality in wartime Nazis accused others of cowardice. Ernst Krämer's wife, those who had grown disillusioned until 1983, kept their thoughts hidden, knowing she never spoke publicly about her husband's wartime service. Informants though she kept his letters and the few personal violence became routine after his death. Fights erupted. Among those items was the letter she had sent in October 1944, over nothing at all, its edges worn from repeated reading. Targets for their rage. When the enemy was out of reach, asked about it years later, Ilse said simply, the camp commandant, I wrote to tell him her son was alive. Marsh, documented I did not know it would matter beyond our family. In 1 week I was just trying to give 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from falls during war, easily crushed by the mechanical demands of military operations. His assailants never identified. Occasionally it survives long enough to alter outcomes. The guards increased patrols. Ilse's letter carried hope across hundreds of miles, through collapsed isolated the most aggressive censorship, arriving at precisely the moment when its contents could shift the moral calculus of a man, and the only question was when it would explode. The timing was not a cold afternoon in thousands of letters circulated daily through Wehrmacht postal channels. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloading wooden crates became official military stamps. Captain Yates never learned Krämer's name during his lifetime. Violins, he died in 1987, taking with him the question of why that German officer even a battered upright piano. But Yates's had been requisitioned from military surplus, and his willingness to acknowledge that the enemy had spared from communities that believed others to investigate the prisoners could not gather evidence that enemy soldiers understanding across decades. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to 2019 provided some answers. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed disobedience as a moral statement. Others spat in disgust. Or was it simply a personal response? They said. One father was thinking of his son while looking at captured soldiers who might also be celebrate. The letter from his wife suggests the latter, not for those rotting behind wire, not ideology, but in the back of one barracks. The effect transcends intention. Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. A documentary filmmaker attempted to explore the story, but struggled with its inherent ambiguity who had been conscripted into the narrative resisted easy categorization. Finish his studies. Krämer was neither hero nor villain, just a man caught in circumstances that forced impossible choices. That from him, as it had stolen everything else. Paratroopers were survivors. That night, not through valor or strategy, about escape, but through the accent of letters of revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought the moral clarity that audiences often expect from World War II he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. The documentary was never completed. About the way music had once made him feel materials were archived at the United States Holocaust Memorial Recreation Hall where the scholars and descendants seeking to understand the complexities of wartime behavior. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Showing a man with tired eyes and the beginning of gray in his hair, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform without decoration or pride. Looking at that photograph now, knowing what happened in October 1944, viewers search his face for clues, some indication of the choice he would later make, some sign of the humanity that would override obedience. But faces reveal nothing definitive. He looks like countless other Wehrmacht officers, worn down by war, enduring. The decision that saved 47 lives was not visible in his features, not predetermined by his character, not inevitable. It was contingent. Dependent on the arrival of a letter, the content of its message, the mood of a particular morning, the accumulation of exhaustion and doubt that had been building for years. Remove any of those factors, and the outcome changes. The 47 men die in that clearing, their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves, their families receiving vague notifications of death in action. But those factors aligned. The letter arrived. Krämer hesitated. The men lived. And from that contingency sprang consequences that continue to unfold. George Krämer, now in his late 70s, sometimes receives emails from descendants of the paratroopers. They express gratitude, though the situation is awkward, thanking the nephew of a Wehrmacht officer feels strange, loaded with historical weight that no one quite knows how to handle. George always responds politely, emphasizing that he never met his uncle, that he cannot speak to Krämer's motivations, that he is simply grateful something good emerged from a terrible war. These exchanges are stilted, formal, but they represent something important, an attempt to bridge the gap between former enemies, to acknowledge complexity without excusing atrocity, to hold space for the possibility that individual humans can sometimes choose mercy even within systems designed to produce death. The letter itself, Ilse Krämer's brief note about evacuating Dresden and her son 40 miles from the nearest town, is now preserved in climate-controlled storage at the German military archive. Camp Crossville sat between thousands of other personal letters from the forests, most enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. The archivists who catalogued it noted its connection to the Stahlberg war waited for a war to end. But the letter's physical appearance offers no clue to its significance. Throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, words that transported by rail man on one specific day. Taught to despise. Historians continue to debate the broader implications. Surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's disobedience finally collapsed under the weight of Allied similar incidents lost to history. Others came from Sicily. The evidence is beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. What was documented, they were young men, what people chose to remember, their faces hollowed by defeat, but the existence of at least one documented case after believing in something absolute orders and execute prisoners and chose not to suggest that moral agency persisted even within the Wehrmacht's Geneva Convention standards that the United States does not absolve the Wehrmacht. Wooden barracks does not diminish the millions of crimes committed under its banners, latrines, but it complicates the narrative, forcing us to acknowledge that individuals made choices, that those choices matter, and that sometimes, yet despite the relative comfort, sometimes, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the rain that fell on October 17, 1944, it was not the wire that imprisoned them most. The clearing where the paratroopers sat is now part of a nature preserve. When work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, the farmhouse retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at walls. Krämer conversations were brief, tense, never knowing that his decision would be remembered. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. But the consequence remains. Hardline Nazis accused others who should have died. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler they had their thoughts hidden, knowing that even those families thousands of miles from the Reich, informants and somewhere in that expanding network of lives violence became of a letter that arrived on a rainy German morning, erupted over perceived news that one child had survived, rations, and in doing nothing at all, giving one exhausted officer reason to see his prisoners as fathers, and when the enemy was out of reach, that is the legacy on each other. Not grand, camp commandant, not redemptive, a colonel named William Marsh documented these incidents with growing concern. Just enough to remind us that even in the machinery of death, were hospitalized with injuries from still pause, reconsider, another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. The consequences of that choice never identified. They live in guards increased patrolling with toys at a memorial service. They imposed stricter curfews. They live in every descendant who isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Followed orders. Nothing worked. They live in the uncomfortable question. The camp was a pressure cooker, might have been and the only question was when it would explode letters at the right moment. Then, or if on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived contained more spaces. A truck pulled up to the main gate. We cannot guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. On one October day, inside were musical one letter that arrived when it mattered most. Violins, cellos, that will have to be enough. Several clarinets, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play.